peace. Welcome to my channel, where stories hit different and every page comes to life.
The Metamorphosis, Part 1. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, armor-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff, arched segments. The bed quilt could hardly stay in place on top of it, and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. "What has happened to me?" he thought. "It's no dream." His room, a regular human bedroom, though rather too small, lay quiet within its four familiar walls. Above the table, on which a collection of cloth samples was unpacked and spread out, Gregor Samsa was a traveling salesman. Hung the picture he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady wearing a fur hat and a fur stole, sitting upright and holding out to the spectator a huge fur muff into which the whole of her forearm had vanished. Gregor's eyes turned next to the window. The overcast sky, one could hear raindrops beating on the window gutter, made him quite melancholy. What about sleeping a little longer and forgetting all this nonsense, he thought. But that could not be done, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side, and in his present condition he could not turn himself over. However violently he forced himself toward his right side, he always rolled onto his back again. He tried it at least 100 times, shutting his eyes to avoid seeing his struggling legs, and only stopped when he began to feel in his side a faint, dull ache he had never felt before. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, next few paragraphs, in the same clean, readable format? Metamorphosis, cleaned up and properly punctuated while keeping the original tone intact. The Metamorphosis. Oh God, he thought. What an exhausting job I've picked out for myself, on the road day in, day out. It's much more irritating work than doing business in the home office. And on top of that, there's the trouble of constant traveling, worrying about train connections, the bad food, irregular meals, and those casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itching up on his belly. Slowly, he pushed himself on his back nearer to the top of the bed so that he could lift his head more easily. He located the itching spot, which was surrounded by many small white dots, the nature of which he could not understand. He was about to touch it with one of his legs, but drew the leg back immediately. For the contact made a cold shiver run through him. He slid down again into his former position. This getting up early, he thought, can make an idiot out of anyone. A man needs his sleep. Other salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the hotel in the morning to write up my orders, these others are only sitting down to breakfast. Let me just try that with my boss. I'd be fired on the spot. Anyhow, that might be quite a good thing for me, who can tell? If I didn't have to hold back because of my parents, I'd have given notice long ago. I'd have gone to the boss and told him exactly what I think of him. That would knock him right off his desk. It's a peculiar habit of his too, sitting on top of the desk like that and talking down to employees, especially when they have to come quite near because he's hard of hearing. Well, there's still hope. Once I've saved enough money to pay back my parents' debts to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it without fail. I'll cut my ties completely then. For the moment, though, I'd better get up, since my train leaves at 5. Want to continue with Part 3, your passage, punctuated and formatted clearly, but every word exactly as in your original text. The Metamorphosis. Part 3. Exact wording, corrected punctuation. He looked at the alarm clock ticking on the chest of drawers. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30 and the hands were quietly moving on. It was even past the half hour. It was getting on toward 6:45. Had the alarm clock not gone off? From the bed, one could see that it had been properly set for 4 o'clock. Of course, it must have gone off. Yes, but was it possible to sleep quietly through that ear-splitting noise? Well, he had not slept quietly, yet apparently all the more soundly for that. But what was he to do now? The next train went at 7 o'clock. To catch that, he would need to hurry like mad, and his samples weren't even packed, and he himself wasn't feeling particularly fresh and energetic. And even if he did catch the train, he couldn't avoid a tirade from the boss, since the messenger boy must have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train and must have long since reported his failure to turn up. This messenger was a creature of the boss's, spineless and stupid. Well, supposing he were to say he was sick, but that would be very awkward and would look suspicious, since during his 5 years' employment he had not been ill once. The boss himself would be sure to come with the health insurance doctor, would reproach his parents for their son's laziness, and would cut all excuses short by handing the matter over to the insurance doctor, who of course regarded all mankind as perfectly healthy malingerers. And would he be so far wrong in this case? Gregor really felt quite well, apart from a drowsiness that was quite inexcusable after such a long sleep, and he was even unusually hungry. As all this was running through his mind at top speed, without his being able to decide to leave his bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15 when there was a cautious tap at the door near the head of his bed. "Gregor," said a voice. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you have a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor had a shock as he heard his own voice answering hers, unmistakably his own voice. It was true, but with a persistent, horrible, twittering squeak behind it like an undertone, which left the words in their clear shape only for the first moment, and then rose up reverberating around them to destroy their sense, so that one could not be sure one had heard them rightly. Gregor wanted to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he confined himself to saying, "Yes, yes, yes, thank you, Mother, I'm getting up now." The wooden door between them must have kept the change in his voice from being noticeable outside, for his mother contented herself with this statement and shuffled away. Yet this brief exchange of words had made the other members of the family were aware that Gregor was, strangely, still at home, and at one of the side doors his father was already knocking gently, yet with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called, "what's the matter with you?" And after a little while he called again in a deeper voice, "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door his sister was saying in a low, plaintive tone, "Gregor, aren't you well? Do you need anything?" He answered them both at once, "I'm just about ready," and did his best to make his voice sound as normal as possible by enunciating the words very clearly and leaving long pauses between them. So his father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg you." However, he was not thinking of opening the door, and felt thankful for the prudent habit he had acquired on the road of locking all doors during the night, even at home. His immediate intention was to get up quietly without being disturbed, to put on his clothes, and above all, eat his breakfast, and only then to consider what else had to be done, since he was well aware that his meditations would come to a sensible conclusion only if he remained out of bed. He remembered that often enough in bed he had felt small aches and pains, probably caused by lying in awkward positions, which had proved purely imaginary once he got up, and he looked forward eagerly to seeing this morning's delusions gradually evaporate. That the change in his voice was nothing but the precursor of a bad cold, a typical ailment of travelling salesmen, he had not the slightest doubt. To get rid of the quilt was quite easy. He had only to inflate himself a little, and it fell off by itself. But the next move was difficult, especially because he was so unusually broad. He would have needed arms and hands to hoist himself up. Instead, he had only the numerous little legs which never stopped waving in all directions and which he could not control in the least. When he tried to bend one of them, the first thing it did was stretch itself out straight, and if he finally succeeded in making it do what he wanted, all the other legs meanwhile waved the more wildly in the most painful and unpleasant way. "But what's the use of lying idle in bed?" said Gregor to himself. He thought that he might get out of bed with the lower part of his body first, but this lower part, which he had not yet seen, and of which he could form no clear picture, proved too difficult to move. It shifted so slowly, and when finally almost wild with annoyance, he gathered his forces together and thrust out recklessly, he had miscalculated the direction and bumped heavily against the lower end of the bed. and the stinging pain he felt informed him that precisely this lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. So he tried to get the top part of himself out first, and cautiously moved his head toward the edge of the bed. That proved easy enough, and despite its breadth and mass, the bulk of his body at last slowly followed the movement of his head. Still, when he finally got his head free over the edge of the bed, he felt too scared to go on advancing. For after all, if he let himself fall in this way, it would take a miracle to keep his head from being injured. And under no circumstances could he afford to lose consciousness now. Precisely now, he would rather stay in bed. But when, after a repetition of the same efforts, he lay in his former position again, sighing, and watched his little legs struggling against each other more wildly than ever, if that were possible, and saw no way of bringing any calm and order into this senseless confusion, he told himself again that it was impossible to stay in bed, and that the most sensible course was to risk everything for the smallest hope of getting away from it. At the same time, however, he did not forget to remind himself occasionally that cool reflection, the coolest possible, was much better than desperate resolves. At such moments, he focused his eyes as sharply as possible on the window. But unfortunately, the prospect of the morning fog, which enshrouded even the other side of the narrow street, brought him little encouragement or comfort. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the alarm clock chimed again. 7 o'clock already, and still such thick fog. And for a little while he lay quiet, breathing lightly, as if perhaps expecting the total silence around him to restore all things to their real and normal condition. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 7:15, I absolutely must be quite out of this bed without fail. Anyhow, by that time someone will have come from the office to ask for me, since it opens before 7. And he began to rock his whole body at once in a regular rhythm, with the idea of swinging it out of the bed. If he tipped himself out in that way, he could keep his head from injury by lifting it at a sharp angle as he fell. His back seemed to be hard, and was not likely to suffer from a fall on the carpet. His biggest worry was the loud crash he would not be able to help making, which would probably cause anxiety, if not terror, behind all the doors. Still, he must take the risk. When he was already half out of the bed, the new method was more a game than an effort, for he needed only to shift himself across by rocking to and fro. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get help. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would be amply sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms under his convex back, lever him out of the bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor, where it was to be hoped his little legs would then find their proper function. Well, ignoring the fact that the doors were all locked, should he really call for help? In spite of his predicament, he could not suppress a smile at the very idea of it. He had already gotten to the point where he would lose his balance if he rocked any harder, and very soon he would have to make up his mind once and for all, since in 5 minutes it would be 7:15 when the front doorbell rang. "That's someone from the office," he said to himself, and grew almost rigid, while his little legs only thrashed about all the faster. For a moment, everything stayed quiet. "They're not going to open the door," said Gregor to himself, grasping at some kind of irrational hope. But then, of course, the maid went as usual to the door with her determined stride and opened it. Gregor needed only to hear the first good morning of the visitor to know immediately who it was, the chief clerk himself. What a fate, thought Gregor, to be condemned to work for a firm where the slightest negligence at once gives rise to the gravest suspicions. "Would you like me to continue with the next section?" This is the next big section, after the chief clerk's arrival, and again, you've got the right text, just full of typos and missing punctuation. Below is the exact clean version of the same passage, corrected but not rephrased, so it's still the same original English translation from the Willer and Edwin Muir version of the Metamorphosis. The Metamorphosis, Part 6. Exact wording, corrected punctuation. Were all the employees nothing but a bunch of scoundrels? Was there not among them one single loyal, devoted man who, if he wasted only an hour or so of the firm's time in the morning, was so tormented by conscience as to be driven out of his mind and actually incapable of leaving his bed. Wouldn't it really have been sufficient to send an office boy to inquire, if any inquiry were necessary, since the chief clerk himself had to come? And did he have to show all his unawareness of the circumstances by coming himself? Was it not obvious that by coming himself, he was indicating to the entire family that some very grave suspicion was attached to Gregor, and that he could investigate the matter better than anyone else? And more through reflections than through any act of will, Gregor swung himself out of bed with all his strength. There was a loud thump, but it was not really a crash. His fall was broken to some extent by the carpet. His back, too, was less stiff than he had thought, and so there was merely a dull thud, not so very startling. Only he had not lifted his head carefully enough, and had hit it. He turned it and rubbed it on the carpet in pain and irritation. "Something fell in there," said the chief clerk in the adjacent room to the left. Gregor tried to suppose to himself that something like what had happened to him today might someday happen to the chief clerk. One really could not deny that it was possible. But as if in brusque reply to this supposition, the chief clerk took a couple of firm steps in the next door room, and his patent leather boots creaked. From the right-hand room, his sister was whispering to inform him of the situation. "Gregor, the chief clerk's here." "I know," muttered Gregor to himself, but he didn't dare to make his voice loud enough for his sister to hear it. "Gregor," said his father now from the room on the left, "the chief clerk has come and wants to know why you didn't catch the early train. We don't know what to say to him. Besides, he wants to talk to you in person, so open the door, please. He will be good enough to excuse the mess in your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk was calling amiably meanwhile. "He's not well," said his mother to the visitor, while his father was still speaking through the door. "He's not well, sir, believe me. What else would make him miss a train? The boy thinks about nothing but his work. It makes me almost cross the way he never goes out in the evening. He's been here all last week and has stayed at home every single evening. He just sits there quietly at the table, reading a newspaper or looking through railroad timetables. The only amusement he gets is working with his fret saw. For instance, he spent 2 or 3 evenings cutting out a little picture frame. You would be surprised to see how pretty it is. It's hanging in his room. You'll see it in a minute when Gregor opens the door. I must say I'm glad you've come, sir. We should never have gotten him to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so obstinate, and I'm sure he's unwell, even if he denied it earlier this morning." "I'll be right there," said Gregor slowly and carefully, not moving an inch for fear of losing one word of the conversation. "I can't think of any other explanation, madam," said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious. Although, on the other hand, I must say that we men of business, unfortunately or perhaps fortunately, very often simply have to ignore any slight indisposition, since business must be attended to." "Well, can the chief clerk come in now?" asked Gregor's father impatiently, again knocking on the door. "No," said Gregor. In the left-hand room, a painful silence followed this refusal. In the right-hand room, his sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister join the others? She had probably just gotten out of bed and hadn't even begun to put on her clothes yet. Well, why was she crying? Because he wouldn't get up and let the chief clerk in, because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the head of the firm would begin dunning his parents again for the old debts. Surely these were things one didn't need to worry about for the present. Gregor was still at home and not in the least thinking of deserting the family. At the moment, true, he was lying on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he was in could seriously expect him to admit the chief clerk. But for such a small discourtesy, which could plausibly be explained away somehow later on, Gregor could hardly be fired on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him in peace for the present than to trouble him with tears and entreaties. Still, of course, their uncertainty bewildered them all and excused their behaviour. "Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk called now in a louder voice, "what's the matter with you? Here you are, barricading yourself in your room, giving only yes and no for answers, causing your parents a lot of unnecessary trouble, and neglecting, I mention this only in passing, neglecting your business duties in an incredible fashion. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and of your employer, and I beg you quite seriously to give me an immediate and precise explanation. You amaze me. You amaze me. I thought you were a quiet, dependable person, and now all at once you seem bent on making a disgraceful exhibition of yourself. The boss did hint to me early this morning a possible explanation for your disappearance, with reference to the cash payments that were entrusted to you recently. But I almost pledged my solemn word of honor that this could not be so. But now that I see how incredibly obstinate you are, I no longer have the slightest desire to take your part at all. And your position in the firm is not exactly unassailable. I came with the intention of telling you all this in private, but since you're wasting my time so needlessly, I don't see why your parents shouldn't hear it too. For some time now, your work has been most unsatisfactory. This is not the best time of the year for business, of course, we admit that, but a time of the year for doing no business at all does not exist, Mr. Samsa, must not exist. But, sir, cried Gregor beside himself and in his agitation forgetting everything else, I'm just about to open the door this very minute. A slight illness, an attack of dizziness, has kept me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed. But I feel all right again. I'm getting out of bed right now. Just give me a moment or two longer. It's not going as well as I thought. But I'm all right, really. How such a thing can suddenly strike one down. Only last night I was quite well, my parents can tell you. Or rather, I did have a slight presentiment. I must have shown some sign of it. Why didn't I mention it at the office? But we always think we can get over any illness without having to stay at home. Oh, sir, do spare my parents. All that you're reproaching me with now has no foundation. No one has ever said a word to me about it. Perhaps you haven't looked at the last orders I sent in. Anyway, I can still catch the 8 o'clock train. I'm much the better for my few extra hours' rest. Don't let me detain you here, sir. I'll be attending to business very soon, and do be good enough to tell the boss so, and to give him my best regards. And while all this was tumbling out in a rush, and Gregor hardly knew what he was saying, he had reached the chest of drawers quite easily, perhaps because of the practice he had had in bed, and was now trying to get himself upright by means of it. He actually meant to open the door, actually meant to show himself and speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to find out what the others, after all their insistence, would say at the sight of him. If they were horrified, then the responsibility was no longer his, and he could relax. But if they took it in stride, then he had no reason either to be upset, and could actually get to the station for the 8 o'clock train if he hurried. At first he slipped down a few times from the polished surface of the chest, but finally, with one last heave, he stood upright. He paid no more attention to the pains in the lower part of his body, no matter how much they smarted. Then he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and clung to its frame with his little legs. With that, he regained control over himself and stopped speaking, for now he could hear that the chief clerk was saying something. Did you understand one single word of that? The chief clerk was asking. Surely he can't be trying to make fools of us. Oh dear God, cried his mother in tears. Perhaps he's terribly ill and we're tormenting him. Greta, Greta, she called then. Yes, mother, called his sister from the other side. They were calling to each other through Gregor's room. You must go this minute for the doctor. Gregor is ill. Go for the doctor, quick. Did you hear how he was speaking? That was the voice of an animal, said the chief clerk, in a voice conspicuously soft compared with the shrillness of the mother's. Anna! Anna! His father was calling through the hall to the kitchen, clapping his hands. Get a locksmith at once. And the two girls were already running through the hall with a swish of skirts. How could his sister have gotten dressed so quickly, and were tearing the front door open? There was the sound of its closing again. They had evidently left it open, as one does in homes where some great misfortune has happened. But Gregor was now much calmer. The words he uttered could no longer be understood, apparently, although they seemed clear enough to him, perhaps clearer than before, because his ear had grown accustomed to the sound of them. Yet at any rate, people now believed that something was wrong with him and were ready to help. The positive certainty with which these first measures had been taken comforted him. He felt himself drawn once more into the human circle and hoped for great and remarkable results from both the doctor and the locksmith, without really distinguishing precisely between them. To make his voice as clear as possible for the crucial consultations that were soon to take place, he cleared his throat a little, as quietly as he could, of course, since this noise too might not sound human for all he was able to judge. In the next room, meanwhile, there was complete silence. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table with the chief clerk, whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Slowly, Gregor pushed the chair toward the door, then let go of it, caught hold of the door for support. The pads at the ends of his little legs were somewhat sticky, and rested against it for a moment after his efforts. Then he set himself to turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed, unfortunately, that he didn't really have any teeth. What was he supposed to grip the key with? But on the other hand, his jaws were certainly very strong. With their help, he did manage to get the key turning, heedless of the fact that he was undoubtedly damaging himself, since a brown fluid issued from his mouth, flowed over the key and dripped onto the floor. "Just listen to that," said the chief clerk in the next room. "He's turning the key." That was a great encouragement to Gregor. But they should all have shouted encouragement to him, his father and mother too. "Come on, Gregor." They should have called out, "Keep going, get a good grip on that key." And in the belief that they were all following his efforts intently, he bit down frantically on the key with all the force at his command. As the turning of the key progressed, he circled around the lock, holding on now only with his mouth, pushing on the key as required, or pulling it down again with all the weight of his body. The louder click of the finally yielding lock literally quickened Gregor. With a deep breath of relief, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith," and laid his head on the handle to open the door wide. Since he had to pull the door toward him, he was still invisible, even when it was really wide open. He had to edge himself slowly around the near half of the double door, and to do it very carefully if he was not to fall flat on his back before he even got inside. He was still carrying out this difficult maneuver, with no time to observe anything else, when he heard the chief clerk utter a loud "Oh!" It sounded like a gust of wind, and now he could see the man, standing as he was nearest to the door, clapping one hand over his open mouth and slowly backing away as if he were being repelled by some unseen but inexorable force. His mother, in spite of the chief clerk's presence, her hair was still undone and sticking out in all directions, first clasped her hands and looked at his father, then took 2 steps toward Gregor and fell on the floor among her outspread skirts, her face completely hidden on her breast. His father clenched one fist with a fierce expression on his face, as if he meant to knock Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept until his great chest heaved. Gregor did not now go into the living room, but leaned against the inside of the firmly shut wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible and his head above it, tilted sideways to look at the others. It had meanwhile become much brighter outside. On the other side of the street, one could see clearly a section of the endlessly long, dark grey building opposite. It was a hospital, its facade relentlessly punctuated by evenly spaced windows. The rain was still falling, but only in large, singly discernible drops, each one of which, it seemed, was literally being hurled to the ground below. The breakfast dishes were on the table in great number, for breakfast was the most important meal of the day for Gregor's father, who stretched it out for hours over various newspapers. Right opposite Gregor on the wall hung a photograph of himself in military service, as a lieutenant, hand on sword, a carefree smile on his face, inviting respect for his uniform and military bearing. "Would you like me?" Restored text. The door leading to the hall was open, and one could see that the front door stood open too, showing the landing beyond and the beginning of the stairs going down. "Well," said Gregor, knowing perfectly well that he was the only one who had retained any composure, "I'll get dressed right away, pack up my samples and start off. Will you be willing to let me go?" You see, sir, I'm not stubborn and I like my work. Traveling is a hard life, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you going now, sir? To the office? Yes. Will you give an honest account of all this? One can be temporarily incapacitated, but that's just the moment for remembering former services and for bearing in mind that later on, when the problem has been resolved, one will certainly work all the harder and with all the more concentration. I'm so indebted to the head of the firm. You know that very well. On the other hand, I have my parents and my sister to worry about. I'm in great difficulties, but I'll get out of them again. Don't make things any worse for me than they already are. Stand up for me in the firm. Salesmen are not popular there, I know. People think they earn piles of money and just have a good time. A prejudice there's no particular reason to correct. But you, sir, have a better view of the situation than the rest of the staff. Yes, let me tell you in confidence, a better view than the boss himself, who, being the owner, lets his judgment be easily swayed against one of his employees. And you know very well that a traveling salesman, who is almost never seen in the office all year long, can so easily fall victim to gossip and bad luck and unfair accusations he can't defend himself against, because he generally knows nothing about them, and only finds out when he comes back exhausted from one of his trips and then has to suffer the terrible consequences in some mysterious personal way. Sir, don't go away without a word to me to show that you think me in the right, at least to some extent. But at Gregor's very first words, the chief clerk had already backed away and only stared at him with parted lips over one twitching shoulder. And while Gregor was speaking, he did not stand still for one moment, but inched toward the door, yet without taking his eyes off Gregor, as if obeying some mysterious order to leave the room. He was already in the hall, and to judge from the suddenness with which he took his last step out of the living room, one could easily have thought he had burned the sole of his foot. Once in the hall, he stretched his right arm before him toward the staircase, as if some supernatural power were waiting there to deliver him. Gregor realized that the chief clerk must on no account be allowed to go away in this frame of mind if his position in the firm were not to be endangered to the utmost. His parents did not understand this so well. They had convinced themselves in the course of years that Gregor was settled for life in this firm. And besides, they were so preoccupied with their immediate troubles that all foresight had forsaken them. But Gregor had this foresight. The chief clerk must be detained, soothed, persuaded, and finally won over. The whole future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was intelligent. She had begun to cry, even while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And no doubt the chief clerk, so partial to ladies, would have been guided by her. She would have shut the door to the apartment and in the hall talked him out of his horror. But she was not there, and Gregor would have to handle the situation himself. And without remembering that he was still unaware what powers of movement he possessed, without even remembering that his words, in all likelihood, would again be unintelligible, he let go of the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and started to walk toward the chief clerk, who was already clinging ridiculously with both hands to the railing on the landing. But immediately, as he was feeling for support, Gregor fell down with a little cry upon all his numerous legs. Hardly was he down when he experienced for the first time that morning a sense of physical well-being. His legs had firm ground under them. They were completely obedient, as he noted with joy. They even strove to carry him along in whatever direction he chose, and he was inclined to believe that a final relief from all his sufferings was at hand. But at the same moment as he found himself on the floor, not far from his mother, indeed just in front of her, rocking with pent-up eagerness to move, she, who had seemed so completely crushed, sprang all at once to her feet. Her arms and fingers spread wide, cried, "Help! For God's sake, help!" Bent her head down as if to see Gregor better, yet on the contrary kept backing senselessly away, had quite forgotten that the breakfast table stood behind her, sat down upon it abruptly and with a confused look on her face when she bumped into it, and seemed altogether unaware that the big coffee pot beside her had been tipped over and that coffee was gushing all over the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor in a low voice, and looked up at her. The chief clerk had for the moment quite slipped from his mind. Instead, he could not resist snapping his jaws together a couple of times at the sight of the streaming coffee. That made his mother scream again. She fled from the table and fell into the arms of his father, who rushed to catch her. But Gregor had no time now to spare for his parents. The chief clerk was already on the stairs. With his chin on the banister, he was taking one last backward look. Gregor made a dash forward, to be as sure as possible of overtaking him. The chief clerk must have suspected what he was up to, for he leaped down several steps at once and vanished. "Hey!" he yelled. It was the last sound heard from him, and it echoed through the whole stairwell. Unfortunately, the flight of the chief clerk seemed completely to unhinge Gregor's father, who had remained relatively calm until now. For instead of running after the man himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in his pursuit, he seized in his right hand the walking stick that the chief clerk had left behind, together with his hat and overcoat, snatched in his left hand a large newspaper from the table, and began stamping his feet and flourishing the cane and the newspaper to drive Gregor back into his room. No entreaty of Gregor's was of any use. Indeed, no entreaty was even understood. No matter how humbly he inclined his head, his father only stamped on the floor all the more forcefully. Over there, his mother had thrown open a window, despite the cold weather, and was leaning far out of it with her face in her hands. A powerful draft set in from the street to the staircase. The window curtains blew in, the newspapers on the table fluttered, and stray pages sailed across the floor. Pitilessly, Gregor's father drove him back, making, "Would you like the Metamorphosis, end of part 1? Exact wording, restored." Hissing sounds like a savage, but Gregor had had no practice yet in walking backward. It really was a slow business. If only he had a chance to turn around, he could get back to his room at once. But he was afraid of exasperating his father with such a time-consuming maneuver, and at any moment the stick in his father's hand might strike him a fatal blow on the back or the head. In the end, however, nothing else was left for him to do, since to his horror he realized that in moving backward he could not even control the direction he took. And so, keeping an anxious eye on his father all the time over his shoulder, he began to turn around as quickly as he could, which was in reality very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, for he did not interfere. Instead, every now and then he even directed the maneuver, like a conductor from a distance, with the point of the stick. If only he would stop making that unbearable hissing noise. It drove Gregor out of his mind. By the time he managed to turn almost completely around, the hissing noise so distracted him that he even turned a little too far. But when he finally succeeded in getting his head right up in front of the doorway, it was clear that his body was too broad to fit easily through the opening. His father, of course, in his present mood, was far from thinking of such a thing as opening the other half of the door to let Gregor have enough space. The only thought in his head was that Gregor should get back into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have allowed Gregor to make the complicated preparations needed for standing upright again and perhaps slipping through the door that way. On the contrary, the father was now making more noise than ever in his effort to drive Gregor forward, as if there were no obstacle in the way at all. To Gregor, though, the noise at his rear no longer sounded like the voice of one single father. This was really no joke, and Gregor thrust himself, come what might, into the doorway. One side of his body rose up. He was tilted at an angle in the doorway. His flank was scraped raw. Horrid blotches stained the white door. Soon he stuck fast and, left to himself, could not have moved at all. His little legs on one side fluttered, trembling in the air. Those on the other were crushed painfully on the floor, when from behind his father gave him a strong push, which was literally a deliverance, and he flew far into the room, bleeding violently. The door was slammed behind him with the stick, and then at last there was silence. Not until it was twilight did Gregor awake out of a deep sleep, more like a swoon than a sleep. He would certainly have awoken of his own accord not much later, for he felt himself sufficiently well rested, but it seemed to him as if a fleeting step and a cautious shutting of the door leading into the hall had aroused him. The electric lights in the street, cast a pale sheen here and there on the ceiling and the upper surfaces of the furniture, but down below, where he lay, it was dark. Slowly, awkwardly trying out his feelers, which he now first learned to appreciate, he pushed his way to the door to see what had been happening there. His left side felt like one single long, unpleasantly tense scar, and he had actually to limp on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been severely damaged in the course of that morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been damaged, and it trailed uselessly behind him. He had reached the door before he discovered what had really drawn him to it: the smell of food. For there stood a bowl filled with fresh milk, in which floated little slices of white bread. He could almost have laughed with joy, since he was now far hungrier than in the morning, and he dipped his head almost up to his eyes in the milk. But soon in disappointment, he withdrew it again. Not only did he find it difficult to eat because of his tender left side, and he could only eat with the cooperation of his whole snorting body. He did not like the milk either, although milk had been his favourite drink, and that was certainly why his sister had set it there for him. Indeed, it was almost with repulsion that he turned away from the bowl and crawled back to the middle of the room. He could see through the crack of the door that the gas was turned on in the living room, but while usually at this time his father made a habit of reading the afternoon newspaper in a loud voice to his mother, and occasionally to his sister as well, not a sound was now to be heard. Well, perhaps his father had recently given up this habit of reading aloud, which his sister had mentioned so often in conversation and in her letters, but that there was the same silence all around, although the apartment was certainly not empty of occupants. "What a quiet life our family leads," said Gregor to himself, and as he sat there motionless, staring into the darkness, he felt great pride in the fact that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and sister in such a fine apartment. But what if all the quiet, the comfort, the contentment were now to end in horror? To keep himself from being lost in such thoughts, Gregor took refuge in movement and crawled back and forth in the room. Once during the long evening, one of the side doors was opened a little and quickly shut again. Later, the other side door too. Someone had apparently wanted to come in and then thought better of it. Gregor now stationed himself immediately before the living room door, determined to persuade any hesitating visitor to come in, or at least to discover who it might be. But the door was not opened again, and he waited in vain. In the early morning, when the doors were locked, they had all wanted to come in. Now that he had opened one door, and the others had apparently been opened during the day, no one came in, and even the keys were on the other side of the doors. It was late at night before the gas lights were extinguished in the living room, and Gregor could easily tell that his parents and his sister had all stayed awake until then, for he could clearly hear the 3 of them stealing away on tiptoe. No one was likely to visit him. Not until the morning, that was certain. So he had plenty of time to meditate at his leisure on how he was to rearrange his life. But the lofty, empty room in which he had to lie flat on the floor filled him with an apprehension he could not account for, since it had been his very own room for the past 5 years. Half unconsciously, and not without a slight feeling of shame, he turned from the door and scuttled under the sofa, where he felt comfortable at once, although his back was a little cramped, and he could not lift his head up, and his only regret was that his body was too broad to get all of it under the sofa. He stayed there all night, spending the time partly in a light slumber, from which his hunger kept waking him up with a start, and partly in worrying and sketching vague hopes, which all led to the same conclusion, that he must lie low for the present, and, by exercising patience and the utmost consideration, help the family to bear the inconvenience he was bound to cause them in his present condition. Very early in the morning, it was still almost night, Gregor had the chance to test the strength of his new resolutions, for his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the hall and peered in apprehensively. She did not see him at once, yet when she caught sight of him under the sofa, well, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown away, could he? She was so startled that, without being able to help it, she slammed the door shut again. but as if regretting her behavior, she opened the door again immediately and came in on tiptoe, as if she were visiting an invalid or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the very edge of the sofa and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing, not for lack of hunger, and would she bring in some other kind of food more to his taste? If she did not do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to the fact, although he felt a wild impulse to dart out from under the sofa, throw himself at her feet, and beg her for something to eat. But his sister had noticed with surprise that the bowl was still full, except for a little milk that had been spilled all around it. She lifted it immediately, not with her bare hands, true, but with a cloth, and carried it away. Gregor was extremely curious to know what she would bring instead, and imagined all sorts of possibilities. Yet what she actually did next, in the goodness of her heart, he could never have guessed. To find out what he liked, she brought him a whole selection of food, all set out on an old newspaper. There were old half-decayed vegetables, bones from last night's supper covered with a white sauce that had congealed, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese that Gregor would have pronounced inedible 2 days ago, a plain piece of bread, a buttered piece, and a piece both buttered and salted. Besides all that, she set down again the same bowl, into which she had poured some water, and which was apparently to be reserved for his exclusive use. And with great tact, knowing that Gregor would not eat in her presence, she withdrew quickly and even turned the key, to let him understand that he could make himself as comfortable as he liked. Gregor's little legs all whirred in his rush to get to the food. His wounds must have healed completely, moreover, for he no longer felt incapacitated, which amazed him and made him reflect how more than a month ago he had cut a finger a little with a knife, and was still suffering from the wound only the day before yesterday. Might it be that I am less sensitive now? He thought, and sucked greedily at the cheese, which more than any of the other delicacies attracted him at once and strongly. One after another, and with tears of satisfaction in his eyes, he quickly devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, had no charm for him. He could not even stand the smell of it, and actually dragged away to some little distance the things he wanted to eat. He had long since finished his meal, and was only lying lazily on the same spot when his sister turned the key slowly as a sign for him to retreat. That roused him at once, although he was nearly asleep, and he hurried under the sofa again. But it took considerable self-control for him to stay under the sofa, even for the short time his sister was in the room, since the large meal had swollen his body somewhat, and he was so cramped he could hardly breathe. Slight attacks of breathlessness afflicted him, and his eyes were bulging a little from their sockets as he watched his unsuspecting sister sweeping together with a broom not only the remains of what he had eaten, but even the things he had not touched, as if these were now of no use to anyone, and hastily shoveling it all into a bucket, which she covered with a wooden lid and carried away. Hardly had she turned her back when Gregor came from under the sofa and stretched and puffed himself out. In this manner, Gregor was fed once in the early morning, while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and a second time after they had all had their midday meal, for then his parents took a short nap, and the girl could be sent out on some errand or other by his sister. Not that they would have wanted him to starve, of course, but perhaps they could not have endured learning more about his feeding than from hearsay. Perhaps, too, his sister wanted to spare them such little anxieties wherever possible, since they had quite enough to bear as it was. Under what pretext the doctor and the locksmith had been gotten rid of on that first morning, Gregor could not discover, for since what he said was not understood by the others, it never occurred to any of them, not even his sister, that he could understand what they said. And so, whenever his sister came into his room, he had to content himself with hearing her utter only a sigh now and then, and an occasional appeal to the saints. Later on, when she had gotten a little used to the situation, of course, she could never get completely used to it. Gregor would occasionally catch a remark which was kindly meant, or could be so interpreted. "Well, he liked his dinner today," she would say when Gregor had gobbled down all of his food, and when he had not eaten, which gradually happened more and more often, she would say almost sadly, "Everything's been left untouched again." But although Gregor could get no news directly, he overheard a lot from the neighboring rooms, and as soon as voices were audible, he would run to the door of whichever room it was and press his whole body against it. In the first few days especially, there was no conversation that did not concern him somehow, even if only indirectly. For 2 whole days there were family consultations at every mealtime about what should be done. But also between meals the same subject was discussed, for there were always at least 2 members of the family at home, since no one wanted to be alone in the apartment, and to leave it altogether empty was unthinkable. And on the very first of these days, the cook. It was not quite clear what and how much she knew of the situation, fell on her knees before his mother and begged permission to leave. And when she departed a quarter of an hour later, she gave thanks for her release with tears in her eyes, as if this were the greatest blessing that could ever be conferred on her, and without any prompting, swore a solemn oath that she would never say a single word to anyone about what had happened. Now Gregor's sister had to do the cooking too, with her mother's help. True, this did not amount to much, for they ate scarcely anything. Gregor was always hearing one of the family vainly urging another to eat and getting no answer, but "Thanks, I've had all I want," or something similar. Nor did they seem to be drinking anything either. Time and again his sister kept asking his father if he wouldn't like some beer, and kindly offered to go and fetch it herself, and when he didn't answer, suggested that she could ask the concierge to fetch it, so that he need feel no sense of obligation. But then a loud "No" came from his father, and no more was said about it. In the course of that very first day, Gregor's father explained the family's financial position and prospects to both his mother and his sister. Now and then he rose from the table to get some document or notebook out of the small safe he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years earlier. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and taking papers out and shutting it again. These explanations were the first cheerful information Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that nothing at all was left over from his father's business. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and of course he had not asked him directly. At that time, Gregor's sole desire was to do his utmost to help the family to forget as soon as possible the catastrophe that had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into a state of complete despair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardor, and almost overnight had become a traveling salesman instead of a little clerk, with of course much greater chances of earning money. And his success was immediately transformed into hard cash which he could lay on the table before his amazed and happy family. These had been fine times, and they had never recurred, at least not with the same sense of glory, although later on Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expenses of the whole household, and did so. They had simply gotten used to it, both the family and Gregor, the money gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there was no special outpouring of warm feeling. With his sister alone had he remained intimate, and it was a secret plan of his that she, who, unlike himself, loved music and could play the violin movingly, should be sent next year to study at the conservatory, despite the great expense that would entail and which would have to be made up in some other way. During his brief visits home, the conservatory was often mentioned in the talks he had with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which could never come true, and his parents discouraged even these innocent references to it. Yet Gregor had made up his mind firmly about it, and meant to announce the fact with due solemnity on Christmas Day. Such were the thoughts, completely futile in his present condition, that went through his head as he stood glued upright to the door and listened. Sometimes, out of sheer weariness, he could no longer pay attention and accidentally let his head fall against the door, but he always pulled himself together again at once, for even the slight sound his head made was audible next door and brought all conversation to a stop. "What can he be doing now?" his father would say after a while, obviously turning toward the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation gradually start up again. Gregor was now informed as amply as he could wish, for his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because it was a long time since he had dealt with such matters, and partly because his mother could not always grasp things at once. That a certain amount of money, not all that much really, had survived the wreck of their fortunes and had even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile. And besides that, the money Gregor brought home every month, he had kept only a few thalers for himself, had never been quite used up and now amounted to a substantial sum. Behind the door, Gregor nodded his head eagerly, delighted by this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could really have paid off some more of his father's debts to the head of his firm with this extra money, and thus brought much nearer the day on which he could quit his job, but doubtless it was better the way his father had arranged it. Yet this capital was by no means sufficient to let the family live on the interest from it. For 1 year perhaps, or at the most 2, they could live on the principal. That was all. It was simply a sum that ought not to be touched and should be kept for a rainy day. Money for living expenses would have to be earned. Now his father was still healthy enough, but an old man, and he had done no work for the past 5 years and could not be expected to exert himself. During these 5 years, the first years of leisure in his laborious though unsuccessful life, he had put on a lot of weight and become sluggish. And Gregor's old mother, how was she to earn a living with her asthma, which troubled her even when she walked through the apartment and kept her lying on a sofa every other day, panting for breath beside an open window? And was his sister to earn her bread? She who was still a child of 17 and whose life hitherto had been so pleasant, consisting as it did in dressing herself nicely, sleeping long, helping with the housework, going out to a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin. At first, whenever the need for earning money was mentioned, Gregor let go of the door and threw himself down on the cool leather sofa beside it. He felt so hot with shame and grief. Often he just lay there the long nights through without sleeping at all, scrabbling for hours on the leather. Or he worked himself up to the great effort of pushing an armchair to the window, then crawled up over the window sill and, braced against the chair, leaned against the window panes, obviously some recollection of the sense of freedom that looking out of a window always used to give him. For in reality, day by day things that were only a little distance away were growing dimmer to his sight. The hospital across the street, which he used to curse for being all too often before his eyes, was now quite beyond his range of vision. And if he had not known that he lived on Charlotte Street, a quiet street but still a city street, he might have believed that his window looked out on a desert waste where grey sky and grey land blended indistinguishably into each other. His quick-witted sister only needed to observe twice that the armchair stood by the window. After that, whenever she had tidied the room, she always pushed the chair back to the same place at the window and even left the inner casements open. If he could have spoken to her and thanked her for all she had to do for him, he could have endured her ministrations better. As it was, they pained him. She certainly tried to make as light as possible of whatever was disagreeable in her task, and as time went on, she succeeded, of course, more and more. But time also allowed Gregor to see through things better too. The very way she came in distressed him. Hardly was she in the room when she rushed straight to the window, without even taking time to shut the door, careful as she was usually to shield the sight of Gregor's room from the others, and as if she were about to suffocate, tore the windows open with impatient hands, standing then in the open draught for a while, even in the bitterest cold, and drawing deep breaths. This rushing around and banging of hers upset Gregor twice a day. He would crouch trembling under the sofa all the while, knowing quite well that she would certainly have spared him such a disturbance had she found it at all possible to stay in his presence without opening the window. On one occasion, about a month after Gregor's metamorphosis, when there was surely no reason for her to be still startled at his appearance, she came a little earlier than usual and found him gazing out of the window, quite motionless, and thus the perfect figure of terror. Gregor would not have been surprised had she not come in at all, for she could not immediately open the window while he was there. But not only did she retreat, she jumped back as if in alarm and slammed the door shut. A stranger might well have thought that he had been lying in wait for her there, planning to bite her. Of course, he hid himself under the sofa at once, but he had to wait until midday before she came again, and she seemed more ill at ease than usual. This made him realize how repulsive the sight of him still was to her, and that it was bound to go on being repulsive. And what an effort it must cost her not to run away even from the sight of the small portion of his body that stuck out from under the sofa. In order to spare her that, therefore, one day he carried a sheet on his back to the sofa. It cost him 4 hours' labor, and arranged it there in such a way as to hide himself completely, so that even if she were to bend down, she could not see him. Had she considered the sheet unnecessary, she would certainly have stripped it off the sofa again, for it was clear enough that this total confinement of himself had not been undertaken just for his own pleasure. But she left it where it was, and Gregor even imagined that he caught a grateful look in her eye when he lifted the sheet carefully a very little with his head to see how she was taking the new arrangement. For the first 2 weeks, his parents could not bring themselves to enter his room, and he often heard them expressing their appreciation of his sister's activities. Whereas formerly, they had frequently been annoyed with her for being, as they thought, a somewhat useless girl. But now both of them often waited outside the door, his father and his mother, while his sister tidied his room. And as soon as she came out, she had to tell them exactly how things were in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had conducted himself this time, and whether there was not, perhaps, some slight improvement in his condition. His mother, moreover, began relatively soon to want to visit him, but his father and sister dissuaded her at first with arguments which Gregor listened to very attentively and altogether approved. Later, however, she had to be held back by force, and when she cried out, "Let me in to see Gregor, he is my unfortunate son. Can't you understand that I must go to him?" Gregor thought that it might be well to have her come in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood things, after all, much better than his sister, who was only a child despite her courage and, when all was said and done, had perhaps taken on so difficult a task merely out of childish frivolity. Gregor's desire to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the daytime, he did not want to show himself at the window, out of consideration for his parents, but he could not crawl very far around the few square yards of floor space he had, nor could he bear lying quietly at rest all during the night. In addition, he was fast losing any interest he had ever taken in food, so for mere recreation, he had formed the habit of crawling criss-cross over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging suspended from the ceiling. It was altogether different from lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely, one's body swung and rocked lightly, and in the almost blissful absorption induced by this suspension, it could happen, to his own surprise, that he let go and fell plop onto the floor. Yet he now had his body much better under control than formerly, and even such a big fall did him no harm. His sister noticed at once the new distraction Gregor had found for himself. He left behind traces of the sticky stuff from his pads wherever he crawled, and she got the idea in her head of giving him as wide a field as possible to crawl around in, and of removing the pieces of furniture that hindered him, above all the chest of drawers and the writing desk. This was more than she could manage all by herself, and what her mother said was enough reason for her to let her father help. So one day, while her father was out, the two women, his sister more excited than she had ever been, set to work with their mother's agreement to move the furniture out of Gregor's room. Hardly had they dragged out the chest of drawers, which was too heavy for them to lift, when Gregor's mother cried out in the middle of the sitting room, leaning on her daughter and almost weeping. Open quote. "Grete, wouldn't it be better to leave the room just as it was? If we remove all the furniture, won't it look as if we've given up all hope of his getting better and are just abandoning him to himself? I think it would be best to keep the room as it always was, so that when Gregor comes back to us again, he'll find everything unchanged and can forget more easily what's happened in between." Close quote. Hearing his mother's words, Gregor realized that the lack of any direct human speech for so long had made him prone to misinterpret things. He'd imagined, perhaps rashly, that the removal of furniture would mean the loss of everything human in his room, but now he saw that she was only showing tenderness and consideration. However, neither his mother nor his sister could be persuaded. His sister insisted that the furniture had to go, while his mother, for her part, was already beginning to take sides with Grete against Gregor's own wishes. So Gregor waited anxiously to see how the two women would proceed. They were still in the next room, resting for a moment from their hard labor, his mother leaning against the armchair and his sister standing beside her with her arms around her. Gregor could see them clearly through the open door. They hadn't yet noticed him because he was lying flat under the sofa. But even as they rested, his mother said, open quote, "All right, Grete, let's start again. We might as well get that chest of drawers out too, but don't you think it would be better if we left the picture on the wall? It seems so lovely, the lady in her fur hat and fur boa. Why not leave that there?" Close quote. Open quote. "All right," said Grete, almost exhausted and rubbing her hands together. "Let's rest a moment." Close quote. Gregor had no intention of letting the picture be taken away. He crawled out from under the sofa and crept slowly up the wall toward the picture. He pressed his hot body against the glass that covered it and clung to it, the sticky substance on his legs holding him tight. At least this picture, which he now completely covered, would not be removed as long as he could cling to it. He turned his head toward the door of the sitting room so he could watch the women when they came back. They hadn't given him much time. His sister came first, and his mother followed. Grete came in, all flushed and still panting, and looked around as if to convince herself that everything was in order. Then her eyes fell upon Gregor. She stood transfixed, then turned slowly to her mother to keep her from seeing what she had seen. But it was too late. Open quote, "Oh God," cried Gregor's mother, her arms spread wide, falling onto the sofa as if her strength had deserted her completely. Close quote. Gregor hurried toward his mother. He wanted to help her, but was scared to climb down since he might fall and hurt himself. Instead, he let himself drop onto the chair beside the sofa and from there onto the floor, but that produced a small noise and his mother fainted. "Gregor!" Grete shouted, shaking her fist and glaring at him. This was the first time she had directly called him by name since his metamorphosis. She ran into the next room to fetch some essence to revive her mother, but Gregor wanted to help too. He crawled after her into the next room, but she seemed to sense him coming and screamed, "Ah!" and slammed the door shut in his face. Now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who was fainting because of him, and he was forbidden to help her. He sat there helpless and a few moments later heard someone hurriedly turning the key in the front door. It was his father coming home. Grete called to him through the locked door. Open quote, Father, something's happened. You must come right away." Close quote. Gregor's father entered, clutching his stick in one hand and a small newspaper in the other. He stood still for a moment, staring wildly around. Then he saw Gregor, and his face contorted with rage. He waved his stick and newspaper and began driving Gregor back into his room, stamping his feet and shouting hoarsely. Gregor's sister had opened the window wide, perhaps to let out the odor, but it brought in the cool air instead. Through that open window, Gregor was driven back, slowly stumbling, his father keeping up a steady stream of inarticulate sounds. Gregor had never before seen his father in such fury, and he ran to escape. But suddenly his father began throwing apples from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, one after another, hurling them without aiming carefully, but with the force of sheer anger. An apple, thrown without much force, grazed Gregor's back and glanced off harmlessly. But another, following immediately, landed right on his back and stuck there. Gregor wanted to crawl forward, as if that incredible pain might disappear if he moved to another spot, but it was as if he were nailed to the floor. With his last conscious look, he saw his mother rushing out of the room, her loosened petticoats trailing behind her, straight into his father's arms, throwing herself upon him and embracing him, pleading for Gregor's life. Open quote, spare him, she cried, clutching his neck. Close quote, but by now Gregor's sight was already failing. This is the end of part 2 of the Metamorphosis. Part 3 begins the morning after this attack, when Gregor's wound from the apple festers and the family's attitude hardens into cold resentment.